friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you're interested in true crime, or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. And I'm going to let you know, outside of like survivor stories, some of my favorite true crime stories are the cold case stories that go unsolved for like years. And the killer thinks that he's gotten off scot free. And then all of a sudden, pieces fall into place and you get that gotcha moment and the case ends up being solved. And that's what today's story is. Today's story lasted almost 3 decades before it was solved. And it was eventually solved after 28 years, thanks to a plastic cup and one dedicated bakery manager. So this story starts in the year 1989, the year that I was actually born, and it takes place in a super small town in Washington state by the name of Acme. It was November 24th, and Mandy Stavik was home from college on Thanksgiving break. This day, she went for a run with her dog, something that she has done so many times before. In fact, Mandy's mom, Mary, usually went with her, and Mary would ride her bike to keep pace with Mandy while she ran. But on this day, Mary had company over, and so she didn't go with Mandy. Mandy just went with her and her dog, Kyra. And sometime later, Kyra would end up returning home, but she would return home with no signs of Mandy. And this obviously set off alarm bells. Mary immediately reached out to Mandy's boyfriend at the time, Rick Zender, as well as police. Now, Mandy was well liked within this community. Like I said, it's a super small town. She was very kind, beautiful girl, very popular. In fact, it was no time before the entire community was out looking for Mandy. But despite the fact that literally everybody was looking for her, it would be 3 days before her body was found. And her body was found by a volunteer firefighter, and it was found in the shallow part of the local river. And she would be completely naked minus her running shoes. Despite the fact that Mandy was covered in cuts and scratches and she had a blow to the head, she had died from drowning. It was also apparent that Mandy had been raped before she was murdered. Now, keep in mind, the year is 1989, and detectives are super excited to try to start utilizing newer technology to find the killer. In fact, Detective Ron Peterson had just recently completed his training with the FBI and working with DNA. Though there were no matches for the DNA that was found on Mandy, they were able to keep and preserve some DNA from the scene in hopes of being able to match it with any incoming suspects that they might have. The police would end up looking into several men in the area, and they would actually collect over 30 saliva samples to compare to the DNA that was found on Mandy, but they got nothing, and the case went absolutely cold for, like I said, almost 3 decades before they would get their first real lead. So with that being said, let's fast forward through time. Literally decades after the murder, Marilee Anderson and Heather Backstrom, who were two local women who had grown up in the area, are sitting at a water park, and they started small talk while their kids played. Now, these two ladies really weren't much more than acquaintances. Despite the fact that they went to the same high school, they really didn't run in the same circles. They weren't really within the same friend group. So they're just making small talk. And what does small talk always lead to in a small town other than one of the biggest things to happen in the small town? And that's eventually where their small talk turned to. What happened to Mandy Stavik? And honestly, when the conversation turned there, both women would end up admitting to each other that they had a hunch as to who the person was that had raped and murdered Mandy. And what's more than that, they both thought that it was the same person. And that person was Timothy Bass. Both women suspected Bass because they both had incredibly uncomfortable experiences with him, where he was being very flirtatious and overly sexual with them. And they just got the creepy vibe from him. He was just like the creepy guy that would do something like this. But they never went to police with this. And I know you're probably wondering as to why they didn't go to police with their hunch. And you got to keep in mind, this is a small town. If they were to go to the police with nothing more than just like a gut feeling, like people are going to talk in this small town. And they really didn't have any proof. They just kind of got this vibe from him, and they didn't want to start any kind of gossip and be the center of any kind of gossip in this small town. However, when the two women ended up getting together and when they both had the same feeling and they both had similar experiences with Tim, that's when they decided that they were going to go to the police and they were going to reach out to the sheriff and let them know their suspicions. And that's exactly what they did. So, despite the fact that police talked to so many men at the time of Mandy's death, they never talked to Bass, despite the fact that his family only lived a few doors down from the Stavic family. So he was living just a couple doors down from Mandy at the time of her death. And his younger brother, Tom, was actually a friend of Mandy's. Now, the reason why they never ended up talking to him is because shortly after Mandy's death, Bass would end up moving out of town, which should be red flag number one. I know that coincidences happen, and just because somebody moves out of town after somebody dies doesn't necessarily implicate them as the murderer. But knowing what we know today, absolutely red flag number one. In this case, it is red flag number one. So, like I said, Anderson and Backstrom would end up going to police with their suspicions, and the detective on the case at this time was Detective Kevin Bohe. And they had already decided that they were going to do another DNA collection at the time of men who would have been living in the area. And they took Bass's name and took his information, and they went to him to see if they could, talk to him and maybe get some DNA. Now, we've hit red flag number one. Red flag number two is insanely bright, flamboyant red flag, because when police went to talk to him, they asked him what he knew about Mandy Stavic. And he acted as though he didn't even recall the name. He feigned ignorance on not even knowing who that was. So this is a red flag for multiple reasons. One, he lived a few doors down from her. They were basically not next door neighbors, but they were neighbors. They shared the same neighborhood. They lived a few doors down. Mandy went running every day that she was home, and she ran by his house every time that she would go running. Two, like I said, his younger brother was one of her friends. Like, his younger brother was friends with her. Three, this is a small town, and it was a big deal that this young girl was raped and murdered. Even if you don't know her personally, being there in that small town during the time that something huge like this happened, you're going to know the name. You're going to be familiar with the case. Like I said, when the two women were talking about what small talk end up going to, small talk ends up going to the young girl who was murdered in Acme, Washington, because it's a small town. That's what small town does. It's small town gossip. So him feigning ignorance on the name and acting like he didn't know anything about Mandy or who she was, that was Such a red flag. Immediately, police knew that this guy was suspicious. Red flag, the next red flag with police, they asked him for his DNA, and they framed it as, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to hide. And Bass refused to give his DNA. And he told his wife at the time that he didn't want to give his DNA because he worried the police were going to frame him. And you can't trust the police, and he thought that they were going to frame him for this murder. So, moved out of town shortly after she was murdered. Claimed not to know who she was, despite everybody knowing who she was, and then refused to give his DNA. So it's already not looking good for Tim. So, despite all this, police really had nothing on him other than he's just being super shady. Like, they don't have any evidence. They have hunches, and they have weird behavior and weird stories, and they think he's lying, but they don't have anything on him. And without having any DNA, they definitely don't have anything on him, because they don't. I mean, the case is 30 years old, and basically what they have from that case is DNA, and they don't have his DNA. So, I mean, they have to let him go. You can't, without like a court order, you can't force somebody to willingly submit their DNA. So right now they're pretty stuck. So, what police would end up doing, and what detectives would end up doing, would be to start looking into Tim's personal life to see if they could utilize anything from his personal life to try to get hold of that tangible evidence that they're looking for. Now, by this point, Tim was married to a woman named Gina Malone, and they had 3 kids together. Tim was working as a delivery driver for a bakery. So police would end up going to the bakery, and they would be talking to one of Tim's colleagues there named Kim Wagner. And Kim was the manager of the bakery. And when police came to talk to her, they really didn't give her any specifics on what they were looking into. And so Kim just kind of pushed them off and directed them to the HR department for the bakery. Police went to the HR department and told them kind of what they were looking into. And the HR department ended up pushing back, saying, hey, you don't have a court order. You don't have any kind of, you have nothing to make us give you stuff on our employees. So we're not going to do that. And that's within their right. I mean, the police didn't have a search warrant. They didn't have any kind of court order. They didn't have to give them anything. And so they didn't. And it kind of fell out there. It just kind of fizzled out there. So now, sometime later, Kim would actually be hanging out with her husband and a couple of their friends, and they would just be making small talk and talking about people at work. So Bass's name ended up getting brought up because he was just a little weird, and they talked about him. And through this conversation, it was brought up that he lived right by the Stavik family home. And when Kim realized that he lived just a couple doors down from Mandy, she remembered the police coming in and talking to her and her directing them to HR. And it's like a light bulb went off in her head. And she realized, she put 2 and 2 together, and she thought, they must be looking for information on Tim because they think that he has something to do with the death of Mandy Stavik. Like, that's probably why they were in the bakery looking for information on Tim. And so she was just direct about it. She ended up contacting the police, and she asked them outright, are you investigating the Stavik murder? Do you think that he did it? Do you think do you think it was him? And so they pretty much told her, we're looking into it. I'm sure they used like their police beating around the bush, like, I'm not going to tell you, but I'm telling you kind of thing. But yeah, she knew that they were looking into Bass for the murder and rape of Mandy Stavik. So what they ended up telling her was, listen, we can't we can't recruit you to help us on this task. All we can do is accept any kind of like evidence or testimony that you bring us. We can't request that you work the case for us, but if you know something or see something, let us know. So Kim's a mom and she knows what this is about now. And she is determined to give Mandy's family some closure. And if she can help with that, and if she can help find a murderer, she's going to do that. So, first thing she does is she gives the police Tim's schedule. She tells them when he's going to be in the store, when he's going to be out on his routes, what his routes are. She laid it all out for them. And police would start to follow Tim on his routes. Now, Tim was abundantly cautious. Everywhere he went and everything he did while he was at work, he wore gloves. And so, despite the fact that police followed him along his route and followed him everywhere he went, he left behind no evidence because he was always wearing gloves. So, they got nothing from following him. They got nothing. Kim would keep a hawk's eye on him the whole time that he was at work, like when he was actually in the bakery. But Tim was abundantly cautious while at work too. You see, the workplace offered to do all the employees' laundries, wash all their uniforms. Tim still took his home with him. He didn't let the workplace do his laundry. Not only that, he would pack up and take home with him all his trash. Anything he brought in for lunch, he would take the trash home with him. Any pieces of candy he ate, he'd stick it in his pockets, he'd take the trash home with him. He literally left nothing behind. Now, in hindsight, this makes sense because Tim's ex-wife, who was his wife at the time, Gina, would later say that the two of them would watch true crime shows together. And while they were watching true crime shows, Tim would say, I wouldn't be stupid enough. I would get away with it. I wouldn't be caught like these people. I would be smarter than that. And so that's exactly what he was doing. He was making sure he left nothing behind. But one day, he let something slip. And Kim was on it instantly. She pounced right out the gate. And thank God she did. Tim had gotten a drink in a plastic cup. And this one time, instead of packing up his trash to take home, he threw it in the trash can before leaving. Immediately, Kim grabbed the cup and put it in her desk before calling the police. They picked the cup up and immediately took it to the lab to compare it to the known DNA that they had collected from Mandy. When the results came back, there was no doubt that they had their guy. The results were 1 in 11 quadrillion that it was him. So on December 17th, 2017, 28 years after the murder, Bass was arrested, and upon his arrest, he was presented with the proof that they had, and he tried to explain it away by saying that he had a secret sexual relationship with Mandy during the time of her death, but no one believed it. In fact, Mandy's sister would go on to say that there was no way that that was possible, and she even said, to put it bluntly, she was so far out of his league. Like, she would not have a physical relationship with him. She was so far out of his league. And everybody else agreed. There were no witnesses who ever saw the two of them together. There was nothing. Now, his wife at the time, Gina was still his wife at the time, and she did give him an alibi saying that she was with him during the time of the murder. So he had an alibi, but still his story's not really looking super strong. It's looking pretty weak. During Bass's trial, his younger brother Tom, who, like I said, was friends with Mandy, testified against his own brother. Bass had gone to Tom and told him that he was worried that they were going to try to pin Mandy's death on him because they found his DNA on her. He told Tom that this was because the two of them had been sleeping together, and he asked Tom to lie to police and say that he had also been sleeping with Mandy in an effort to make her look like the type of person to sleep around. Tim's ex-wife also testified against him. She testified that she had lied in providing an alibi for Tim when police asked her about the day that Mandy was killed. She did this at Tim's request. She also testified that Tim was physically and verbally abusive. So Bass ended up being found guilty of rape, murder, and kidnapping, and he ended up being sentenced to 27 years in prison. And what frustrates me the most about this sentencing is the fact that he went without being caught for a longer period of time between Mandy's death and when he was arrested than the amount of time he'll serve in prison. It was 28 years before the case was solved, and he was sentenced to 27 years in jail. So it really frustrates me. He got to go free for 28 years and then get sentenced to 27 years. It's just, I feel like if you evade police for that long, something should add on to your sentencing. You know what I mean? Like, you got to enjoy a stolen piece of your life. Like, he should have been sentenced 28 years ago, and he should have spent 27 years in prison during his prime time of his life, not outliving it up. And since he got to enjoy his life while evading being caught for 28 years, I feel like that should be taken into account with his sentencing, and it should make the penalty higher. Like, I don't feel like the punishment fits the crime. Yeah, if the crime is 27 years, that's fine, but 27 years after I don't know. I think it's messed up. I really think it's messed up. So he is currently incarcerated right now under close custody, and he does have a tentative release date for January of 2036, which would make him right at retirement age when it's time for him to be released from prison. So while it's super unsatisfying to know that this asshole got away with it and got to live a normal life for 30 years after taking Mandy's life at such a young age and robbing her of any chance of having a life, of getting to really live her life, it is still super satisfying to know that he probably thought he got away with it. And 30 years later, you get that gotcha moment and everything clicks into place. And we got to have that satisfying moment of him having his day in court and him finally being behind bars. So I'll be honest, this is one of my favorite stories thus far. While it doesn't have necessarily like a traditional happy ending where it's like a survivor story, it still has what I consider to be a relatively happy ending because 30 years of being a cold case, you pretty much give up hope after that amount of time. You know what I mean? Like you kind of give up after a certain amount of time that it just seems like the guy's going to get away with it. And in this case, he didn't. And this is a cool little fact. I'm going to add this on here at the end. Mary, Mandy's mom, actually found out that they found the guy on her birthday. And she said that that was a wonderful birthday present. Anyway, like I said, it's one of my favorite stories thus far. I freaking love science. My husband and I, we often joke that we are a science family. Science is cool as hell. The fact that they were able to preserve DNA for 30 years and use it to finally get the guy off of a piece of trash that he threw away in the break room. I think that's awesome. this is the kind of shit I can get into. And if you can get into it too, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and join me for all these morbid conversations that I'm trying to put out weekly, twice a week. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm doing nothing but recording and editing videos. But you know what? I love it, and I hope you love it too. Until our next chat, as I always say, my friends, take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later. All right? Bye.